It's the late 1990s, the Locle, Switzerland, a small workshop in a town most Americans couldn't find on a map. Inside that workshop, working on grand complications and minute repeaters and tourbillons and perpetual calendars, there's this handful of young watchmakers, and they're sitting adjacent on some benches. Some of them are in their 20s, some of them are in their 30s. Most of them are broke. None of them are famous. And in about 20 years, the watches built by the people in that workshop will sell for the price of a house, the price of three houses, and then the price of an entire apartment building. And almost every brand you'd consider the names of modern independent watchmaking, almost every single one will trace its origins back to that single room. Now, the last episode, I told you about a brand whose value lives in the significant part, in its recognition. We talked about Rolex. This episode is the opposite vertex of that triangle. Three brands whose value lives in their bloodline, in the workshop they came from, in the names of the people who trained them. This is the story of what happened when that workshop scattered.
Hey! Wachowski! Yeah! What's on your wrist, eh? Perpetual calendar, three-hander, stainless steel.
Welcome back to What's on Your Restate. I'm Wachowski. The Rolex episode landed harder than any episode that we've done so far. So thank you for that. The direct messages, the listener emails, just the watch friends that were sharing it. It's been humbling. And again, it's been genuinely overwhelming. We're going to do eventually, I think, sort of a listener email mail episode, but I don't know when yet. I'm trying to determine what that's going to look like, but just know that that's on the horizon. Now, today we're going to do something that the show hasn't done before. We're going to walk through three brands in one episode, but with this thesis that ties them all together. So not just like three brands that I thought were interesting. Again, it's not going to be a deep dive in the kind of Chapek or Dornblut sense. It's think of this kind of as more of like an essay that there is a theme or a thread that runs through all of these. This single workshop again that you've probably never heard of, and three brands that have emerged from it and went in three completely different directions. So settle in. We're going to. It looks like Le Loc, but it's actually pronounced, I believe, Le Locle. And good, oh, good, 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 good. Please pray for me as I go through this, because if you came for the watch enthusiasm, you're gonna stay for me butchering languages. Let's roll. All right, so segment one, we've got Renaud and Papi, the workshop that made the makers. So let me give you a name, kind of depending on how deep you are in this hobby, will either be completely new or will kind of need this explanation, maybe an explanation and a half into independent watchmaking. So Renaud and Papi, and you're gonna hear it. It's pronounced better than I would, but it's founded in 1986 by two complications specialists from. Here we go. Right here comes Restate trying to get his French. Man, all right. Vaile du Joux. Vaile du Joux. One of them was named Giulio Papi, and the other one was named Dominique Renaud. And they set up this shop, and it's in one of the historic hearts of Swiss watchmaking. So the original mission was pretty simple. It was to make grand complications for high-end brands. Now that doesn't sound simple, but the mission was, we're going to make grand complications for these high-end brands. We will make the minute repeaters, the perpetual calendars, the tourbillons, the hardest and most beautiful mechanical functions in watchmaking, and we're going to build them for them, and then they can purchase them from us, okay? So in 1992, Audemars Piguet, you know them as AP, they acquired this company. So from that point forward, Renaud and Papi has really been formally known as Audemars Piguet, Renaud and Papi. And so you're going to see this APRP for short. And it functions both as AP's in-house complications atelier, and this is kind of the most important part, is it's kind of this, you know, complication supplier to these other top brands. And so If a major maison, for example, wants to launch a serious complication and it doesn't have the in-house capabilities, they're going to go to APRP and they're going to reach out to them and they're going to say, we need, and then they'll fill in the blank with whatever they need. And that has been kind of the structure for the past 30 years or so. And here's the part that almost no one outside of this hobby is going to talk about. In the late 1990s and then into the early 2000s, that little shop in the Locle, um, with its couple dozen watchmakers, became kind of the de facto finishing school for an entire generation of young independent watchmakers working kind of adjacent benches in that period in various roles at various times. You had, and no joke here, you had Robert Greubel, which again, if you're going to hear Robert, it's actually, I believe, Robert, and then it's pronounced Greubel. So when you hear like Greubel Forsey in the United States, I believe it's actually Greubel Forsey. I think that's how the German brothers and sisters would say it. Now, I could be screwing that up too. You're also going to hear about Bart and Tim. So you're going to hear about the Grönefelds brothers, right? You're going to hear about Andreas Streller. And so these people, if you're familiar with Greubel Forsey and Grönefeld and Streller, you're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. These are some heavy hitters in our space, okay? And they would design movements you know, for major brands around the world. So you're going to hear a ton of these brands. And so that's kind of what I think is really the exciting part of what we're going to be talking about. Now, there's also Kasapi. You're going to hear Carol, for example, who designed what would be Ulysses Nardin's The Freak in that movement. Again, the director is now, you're over at Tag Heuer. You're going to hear about Anthony de Haas, who would later become the movement director at Elanga and Zone. And so that group of people, they literally sat by side from each other. They ate lunch together and they borrowed each other's tools. I don't know if they actually borrowed tools. That part I may or may not have had some creative liberties in my writing. They watched each other solve problems on the benches. They saw each other get frustrated with movements, for example. And then one by one, they would walk out the door and they would go and actually build brands that today I would argue define the modern independent watchmaking, all from that same place. And so that's the bloodline of hot horology for the last 20 years. And that's the frame that I want you to carry through this entire episode. The skill is the same. Everyone we're going to talk about has the same roots. What's different completely or fundamentally is the philosophy that each of them chose to walk out that door with and then build their own brands. And I think that's the most beautiful thing, is that you can have people who were trained exactly the same and they can go and do completely different things based on their background, based on their likes, based on their experiences, based on how they see beautiful movements and what they want to see in the world and what they want to create. And I think that is so stunning. I think when we have those moments to be able to kind of witness that, and the fact that we get to witness it now is amazing. So let's talk about Greubel Forsey. I would call them the maximalists. And again, you're going to hear Greubel Forsey. And so if you hear me pronounce Greubel Forsey, just know that I did my best to pronounce them correctly. And so if Renaud and Papi is kind of the cradle, think of Greubel Forsey as the version of that cradle's kind of DNA that decided to take watchmaking as far as humanly possible. So let's talk about that story. So Robert Greubel, which is again Robert Greubel, he's a Frenchman. He was from this place that's kind of like on the German border. He's born into watchmaking, so his father ran a business called Greubel Horology, right? He had the horology like kind of in his blood, and so Robert started his career at IWC working on grand complications, and then in the 90s he actually joined Renaud and Papi as a complications prototypist, which again is pretty exciting. This is literally, as they're prototyping, they're trying stuff out. Eventually he became a managing director and I believe then a partner, and spent kind of the better part of a decade at that bench. And now let's get into Stefan Forsey, right? The other side of Greubel Forsey, right? An Englishman, right? He's from St. Albans, I believe. He studied at WASTEP, and the kind of that WASTEP, if you don't know, WOSTEP, it's the watchmakers of kind of Switzerland training program, the education program that they have in Neuchâtel. And he spent the late 80s and 90s restoring antique watches at Asprey in London. And so That's fascinating too. It's this very prestigious British jeweler, and then in, I believe, the early '90s, like '92, and I could be wrong about that, so someone correct me if I got that wrong. He joined, Robert and that team over at Renaud and Papi, and so they worked side by side at R&P for, I believe, the entire mid to, like, late 1990s, and again, I was in, like, high school. So, two watchmakers obsessed with the same question, how do you make mechanical movements more precise? So, in 1999, they both started working kind of independently. And then in 2001, they formalized this partnership that was kind of founded and they called it Compli. It's Compli and then capital Time. And Compli initially kind of started as this complications house and the same kind of model as R&P kind of operated. They made complicated movements for other brands basically. And then in 2004 at Basel World, they actually launched their own brand under their own name. So you'll see Greubel Forsey, right? Greubel Forsey. And the debut was pretty rad. It was this it was a home run. It was I would say, a great debut of watches for the modern era. It was the double tourbillon 30 degrees. Now, here's what that watch does. It has this first tourbillon cage. It's inclined at 30 degrees. It rotates once per minute. And then inside another tourbillon cage, which is level and then rotating once every 4 minutes. So the inclined inner cage is rotating inside at a slower rate than the outer cage. The mathematical purpose of this is to average out with the errors, the gravity that introduces itself onto the balance wheel in different positions. So in other words, and that sounds insane, it's hard enough to get a single tourbillon right, but then to duplicate them and then put them inside moving at different speeds. They took the most complicated escapement regulation device in horology, and then they made it even more complicated. And in doing so, it made it measurably more precise. Now, remember from the very beginning, they were obsessed with precision, and that was just their like opening shot. It's like, hey, we just kind of showed up, right? It would be like sort of me starting a podcast, and then oh, by the way, I just got like the heaviest hitters ever in horology to come and be like, hey, we're going to go have a cup of coffee and record that interview. It was absolutely insane, right? And so after or over the next 2 decades, Rubel Forsey would patent what they called their fundamental inventions. And then they had 7 of them initially. Now they have 10. Okay. Each one of them is a major architectural innovation. They have a quadruple tourbillon with 4 tourbillons connected by this like spherical differential. They have this tourbillon 24 seconds. They have that tourbillon itself, the 24. It it completes a rotation every 24 seconds instead of the traditional 60. They have a GMT with this three-dimensional rotating globe at 8 o'clock, and eventually, and this is what kind of the watch for me defines what Greubel Forsey is they have the handmade one. And the handmade one is, in concept, it's kind of a manifesto. It's 95% of the watch's components, including the hairspring, are made using only hand operated tools. Now, again, tip of the hat to the dudes over at Dornbluth, for example, right? This is their jam, right? They're not using CNC machines. They're not using any modern industrial production. They're using hand tools. Each watch takes approximately 6,000 hours to make. That's roughly 3 years of person hours per watch. And it won the best men's complication watch in 2020 at the Grand Prix, which is essentially kind of the Oscars of watchmaking. Pricing, let's take a deep breath here. Let's just be honest about it. A Greubel Forsey starts north of 400,000 Swiss francs. And for Swiss francs, if you're comparing them to the US dollars, that's really painful. A handmade one is north of $1 million. So just a standard, and I would say standard, right? Like there's a standard Greubel Forsey, but a standard Greubel Forsey again, upwards of 400,000 Swiss francs. Again, when you're listening to this, it may be much higher. And a handmade one is again north of 1 million. So they're not like aspirational watches. They're not even like aspirational watches. These are watches for people whom money has like fundamentally stopped being a constant and is just like, I want something that no one else can have. Now, so why am I spending time on a brand that I will never own and that probably my listeners may not ever own? Maybe you do. That would be awesome. But The reason I'm doing it is because Greubel Forsey is what happens when watchmakers decide that the upper limit doesn't exist, right? There is no ceiling. They took the skills that they learned at R&P and they applied it to a question. And again, you know that I love questions. What if you didn't compromise anything ever? What is the most precise, most architecturally ambitious, the most hand finished watch that could be humanly possibly made? And that's kind of the maximalist part. And whether you're like ever going to wear one or ever see one or just even just admire them in person, just knowing that the brand exists is what I think gives the rest of the independent watchmaking kind of its ceiling. It's like they were like, well, I don't like that ceiling. We're going to make a new ceiling. And what that does is I think the reason I'm bringing them up is because it brings up the entire industry. They all see what's possible. And so as a result, it's like maybe we should do something a little different. Maybe we should try something a little different. And again, every independent watchmaker is going to be hopefully seeing this high end and then being measured against it implicitly. And so, what is Greubel Forsey doing? They're doing something remarkable. Now, I need to address again the elephant in the room because we're going to be honest in this podcast. In early 2026, just a few months ago, Forsey was terminated from the brand that he co founded after 25 years. The watch community had been kind of processing, and we're still processing that now. So the report structure is, you know, Robert Greubel or Greubel, he held the majority, 51%. Forsey's 49%. Reports from these credible industry sources. Now, again, I could be wrong on some of this stuff, but this is where we get into some of the drama, the television show type stuff that we can see in our industry. The sources suggest that the partnership had been under this strain over fundamental disagreements about the brand's direction, possibly including the sale or questions of design strategy. And again, with a 51-49% split, that's where the relationships can break. Math will typically decide. And in this case, it did. And if you go back to listening to the Chopek episode that we did, you kind of see there may be differences there. Now, I don't think obviously that the collector world is going to go, well, he went a different direction or they got pushed out and they're not going to do anything. It's like I would be fascinated to see what's going to be coming up next, right? As this person spins off, possibly they do their own thing. So again, what does this mean for collectors? Well, first thing, the watches that have already been made are obviously not going to be affected. The handmade one, the quadruple tourbillon, the various double tourbillon variants, those are historical objects now. They will, I think, only become more important over time. Now, second, the future and current and future production, the brand's direction is genuinely uncertain. With Stefan out now and Robert in majority control, the next chapter of Greubel Forsey is going to look different. Now, how different, we don't know. As this is being recorded, we don't know. And that's kind of, I think, part of it is uncertainty on their side, but also excitement on our side because we get to see what happens. Now, third, this is the part that kind of matters most. Stefan Forsey is still Stefan Forsey. So he's still one of the greatest watchmakers of his generation. The bloodline doesn't care about ownership splits. Wherever he ends up, whatever he does next, that's going to be worth paying attention. And I think from my perspective, the community is going to be watching. Now, I want to be careful with how I say this. We don't have all the facts. So what I have just said here, as information comes out in future months and years and decades, as this sort of sits, just know that this is based on the best information that I have available at this time. And again, as things change, we can update show notes and that kind of stuff and correct. But currently, that's the information that we have. Now, again, there's a lot of tension that could be there as well. And some of the stuff may not ever come out. I say that again, we don't have all the facts. We probably may never know. Watch partnerships are intensely personal. And what happens between two founders over 25 years is not something for us to litigate from the outside when we know nothing about them, right? So what we can do, I think, as enthusiasts is acknowledge that something significant happened, that, you know, hold complicated feelings about it, that there are a variety of challenges that probably occurred, and then to continue to honor the watches that both of these men made together. Now, Greubel Forsey's catalog from 2004 to 2025, I think, is one of the most important bodies of work in modern hot horology. That's not going to change. But again, as we think about this, sometimes when we have watchmakers in these spaces, and some of them have aspirations that maybe the other ones don't, or they have different foci for what they want to do. It's fascinating to watch as brands mature and grow. And I think from the maximalist part, I think that's what makes this the first brand of the episode. And we're going to go start to climb from there. And we're going to be climbing down from here. So let's talk about now in a different direction. We're going to talk about the Grönefelds. I'm going to call this segment 3 the homecoming path. Now, second brand we're going to get into from one of the loudest brands, I think, in hot horology to I think one of the quietest, the Grönefelds. And you're going to hear Grönefeld, Grönefels, Grönefelds. And if you think that Greubel Forsey took their R&P training as kind of a launching pad, let's go to Geneva and let's launch this in Switzerland. Let's complicate this absolute apex of the industry, and let's take Bart and Tim and let's go do something different. They went home. So here's their story. So the Gronefelds had a 3-generation watchmaking family in a small Dutch town, and here comes Reste butchering countries all over the world and cities and states. You're welcome. You get your money's worth, right? Here we go. Okay, so it's spelled Oldenzal. Oldenzaal in Eastern Netherlands, and so they're kind of, again, near the German border. About 30,000 people are there. So the way that I've pictured it, and again, doing homework, you see cobblestone streets, see Dutch kind of bell gable roofs. There's a basilica from like the 13th century, right? And so I think it's just, for me, again, fascinating stuff. So you have these chiming clock towers that are in the center of town. And so it started with Johann Grönefeld, born in 1896 in that same town, right? Became a watchmaker in 1912, yes, and he was in his teens. That's what folks did back then, right? You got a job early. Remember those pictures you can see of like the 3 and the 5-year-olds sweeping chimneys with their parents. And he set up a workshop and a jewelry kind of shop in this kind of shadow of the basilica. And critically, he became the watchmaker responsible for maintaining the basilica's clock tower mechanism. Now think about that. The mechanical heart of the entire town's clock was basically his bench for decades. And so when Johann died in 1974, his son took over, Johannes Grönefeld. He was known as Chef. And so again, Johannes, they call him Chef. And he was born in 41, same workshop, same family business, same clock tower for 3 decades. And so Chef had 2 sons. He had Bart, who was born in 1969, and he had Tim. And both of them, in this kind of inevitable fashion, right, became watchmakers. And so now here's the part where Renaud and Papi enters this picture. So Bart's path went like this: technical engineering school in Oostendal, and then he went on to watchmaking school in Rotterdam, and then Wostep in Neuchâtel, and then a stint at Osprey in London. Yes, the same Osprey that Greubel Forsey worked, and then RMP in the Locle. So working on minute repeaters, chronographs, all the stuff. Now, Tim's path followed his brother into Wostep and then into RMP. And for the better part of like the late 1990s into the 2000s, the Grönefeld brothers were at RMP. They worked on complications. They sat at the same bench, and then, again, same bench that Robert and Stefan did. They were eating in like the same canteens, and again, this is not a metaphor. They literally worked together. They're friends, and I believe that they're all still friends today. Maybe not so much with the falling out, but you know what I mean. Now, then in the early 2000s, the brothers, they went home. They went back to Oostendal. They went back to their family workshop, to that town with the clock tower that their grandfather had maintained, and they started to build their own watches. And the first watch was the GTM-06 in 2008. It was a tourbillon minute repeater, again, the most complicated watch the Netherlands had ever produced. 325,000 euros at launch. The brothers Grönefeld were on a Dutch national television to introduce it. And then in 2010, 1 Hertz. It was actually the world's first independent jumping seconds wristwatch, which means that the seconds hand advances 1 full second at a time via this independent secondary gear train. And it won the watch of the year from time zone. So think about that for a second. You're gonna have all of this crazy complications on your watch. Typically, as watchmakers, they want their hand to smooth sweep so that everybody knows this is an automatic watch and it's actually ticking 5, 6, 8, 10 times a second, right? And it's moving, sweeping. These guys made the watch tick like as if it was a quartz watch, but it was actually a mechanical watch. And the engineering behind that is pretty intense. Then they had this parallax tourbillon. It won the GPHD Tourbillon Award. But the watch that I wanna spend time on, the one for me that is kind of like, is the Grönefeld brothers object, is this 1941, the Remontoir. It was released in 2026, and the 1941 is named after the year of their father's chef's birth. And the 1941 case is 39.5 millimeters. It's kind of sinuously shaped. It's designed to honor the small town watchmaking heritage of the brothers. And the complication, this is the part that should give you chills. It's an 8-second constant force remontoire. Now, a remontoire, if you don't know what that is, it's a mechanism that periodically retensions a small intermediate spring, and it releases constant force to the balance wheel that it will let the mainstream's power kind of gradually fade. And what does is it produces an even rate. So mechanically speaking, it is just beautiful. But what you'll see is this on the dial side, something just remarkable. And it's hard for me to explain it. So when you're done with this, just go take a look at the 1941 and look up Grönefelds, and you'll be like, whoa, what is happening right here? And so the inspiration for that remontoire, again, the inspiration was this mechanism that was at the clock tower, and it's been there since 1913. The same clock tower that, Johann had maintained as a young man, the same clock tower that Bart and Tim grew up hearing chime every quarter hour, the same clock tower that their father Seth had continued to maintain into his 80s. The 1941 repertoire is, in essence, a wristwatch homage to the family's century-long relationship with that small Dutch town's church bell, and that should bring chills to you. It's remarkable. And the watch, I think, that won the GPHG Men's Watch Prize in 2016. The hobby paid attention, and since then, the brothers have expanded the 1941 case into more accessible formats. Like there's the 1941 Principia, and it's an automatic version of the case that kind of serves the brand's entry point, starting at around 30,000 euros. And again, 30,000 is not cheap. I understand that. And the complications can go way up from there. So in 2023, they released their first chronograph, the 1941, and then they call it the Chronograph. See, they've got a little bit of humor, right? Which won the GPHG's chronograph prize. And so they just keep winning. And this whole time, like the whole time, they've been working out of the family's workshop back home with a small team building somewhere in the low hundreds of watches per year. And so recently they moved into a larger space. It's right next to the basilica. And their grandfather's shop is still just down the road. And their father in his 80s still visits. The Gronefelds are what happens, I think, when watchmakers take the skill of RMP and they apply it to a question with a completely different angle. They took a different angle than Greubel Forsey asked. Greubel Forsey asked, what's the upper limit of horological invention? The Gronefelds asked, again, I think I'm interpreting, what is the most personal, the most meaningful watch I could possibly make in the place that I'm from for the people that I love? So, again, two answers, two completely different questions, two completely different paths, but the same RMP DNA that we got. So, that's kind of the homecoming path. And it might be my favorite story again in modern watchmaking. So, now we're going to get into segment 4, Pequignet. And I'm going to call them the French sleeping giant. Pequignet is Pequignet. The third brand, and again, another brand that you probably haven't heard of, and also the brand that you could actually walk away with in a boutique or online like today. And you're going to hear me pronounce them Pequignet. The French is Pequignet. Pequignet. They were founded in 1973 in Morteau, small French town near kind of the Swiss border. And it's kind of the historical heart of French watchmaking. So again, under Emile Pequignet is kind of the first like sort of 3 decades. And they were respected French watch brand. They used mostly Swiss movements. They made beautiful watches and they actually survived the quartz crisis. They changed hands and they faded somewhat, but then in 2009, something extraordinary happened. The owner, Didier, he made an announcement that the brand was going to do something that nobody in France had attempted to do in decades. They were going to develop 100% French designed hot horology movements from the ground up. And this was, and I want enthusiasts to feel the weight of this, it was a national project. France's watchmaking industry had almost completely been hollowed out by the quartz crisis. The country that, you know, 400 years ago had been kind of at the forefront of horology and whose Protestant watchmakers fled to Geneva and became the foundation of Swiss watchmaking, that country had essentially stopped making serious mechanical watches and serious mechanical movements. And then Pequignet decided to bring it back and they hired experienced movement designers. They built a testing lab. They spent years. They produced 270, again, to my knowledge, industrial drawings. They manufactured 120 stamping tools for just the gears that they wanted to run. They sourced 302 original components in Jura, right? The French and Swiss arc that runs through those Jura mountains, right? And not only outsourced components that were kind of the regulating organ, which came from, Swatch Group's Nivarox. Nobody else in the world was making hairsprings of that quality at the time. And then in 2011, they released it, the Calibre Royale, a 31 millimeter hot horology movement with a single barrel, 96 hours of power reserve running at a 3 hertz beat rate, an oversized free sprung balance, gold compensating screws, 318 components, 8 international patents, and the first French made hot horology movement in the modern era. Pequignet brought it to Basel in 2010, I believe, as a prototype, and the watch press took notice. People in the know took notice. Then the brand went through a difficult kind of industrialization period, and making grade movement at scale are completely different animals. So making grade movement, people might be able to do that, but making it at scale, it can get really complicated. And, they got there. And so now where is RMP and the thread that kind of reappears? Well, according to credible sources, and again, this may get corrected over history, it may get confirmed or refuted, we'll find out. Independent retailer write-ups and watch press coverage when Pequignet was building out its movement design, they hired engineers who had previously worked at Greubel Forsey. And the numbers that tend to surface are 2 to 3 designers, engineers. So we'll go with 3. We'll say 3 former Greubel Forsey engineers helped design the Calibre Royale, and now it's successors. So now I want to be careful here. Pequignet's official materials, they do not emphasize this. It's not on their website. They haven't held a press conference about it, but the claim, again, has appeared in enough independent third-party sources that it's plausible enough to discuss, I think, seriously. And critically, when you look at the watches themselves, the engineering ambitions kind of support it. The Calibre Royale is architected in a way that integrates the case that allows such slim profiles and this engineering thinking that comes from people who have worked there from the very, very top. Whether whether or not the exact rumors documented, the evidence I think sits on people's wrists all the time. If you look at the Concorde, for example, and I'm going to get into the Concorde, it sits very, very low, and it shows you that there was this attention to detail in regard to how small they can make the rehaut in the watch and how the crystal can get slammed down really close to those hands where it doesn't look like there's a crystal at all. So again, the RMP bloodline, in other words, doesn't just produce, and it didn't just produce Greubel Forsey, the Grönefelds and others. The bloodline also produced engineers who, after this time of the apex, they found their way to Morteau and they helped revive some French watchmaking. And that is also what this kind of looks like. Sometimes it's famous co-founders, sometimes it's the engineers behind the bench, and sometimes you've never heard of some of these people and they are just quietly carrying skills across a border. So today, Pequignet has multiple in-house calibers. They have the Royale, they have the manual, they have a 100-hour power reserve on some of their movements. They have the initial as well, that was launched, I think, in 2021. It's a 28.2 diameter, 4 hertz beat rates, 65-hour power reserve, and 72% of those components are made in France. And they're all made within like an 80-kilometer radius of Morteau in their workshop. And again, the Royal, they have a tourbillon, which is the brand's first flying tourbillon. And then this is the part that should kind of make you sit up a little bit. In 2023, the brand's 50th anniversary, Pequignet launched the Concorde. It's a cushion case, it's an integrated bracelet, and it kind of this like almost spearhead kind of links, and it pays homage to these obelisks in Paris. So they have a 36 and a 40 millimeter, they have steel, they have titanium, and the Concorde is on wrist a quietly remarkable watch. Let me tell you why. Because the movement that's inside of that watch is something that's not only in-house, it is something that was thought through. You can tell it wasn't just a movement that was dropped in. It was a movement that was designed, and then this casing in the watch was built around it. Pequignet controls both the movement architecture and the case geometry, and so they can make specific decisions that the watchmakers, when they're buying an off-the-shelf movement, for example, cannot do that. Specifically, what I mean is they're able to design a movement that sits unusually high in the case, and to design the case to bring the dial unusually low to the crystal. And that means that in practice, the rehaut is kind of ridiculously shallow, and the hands and the indices appear almost flush with the sapphire. So visually, there's a depth of the dial that all looks really compressed. And if you've ever picked up like a Laurent Ferrier, for example, felt quietly, they kind of feel quietly, deeply satisfying. But then there's almost this flat relationship between the dial and the crystal, and it almost feels like, and it wears like a piece of jewelry rather than a piece of equipment. And if you've seen these watches, you probably know what I'm talking about. The Laurent Ferrier achieves it through kind of this vertical integration and obsessive in-house design. And I think the Pequonnet Concorde achieves that at the same effect. But the Pequonnet is doing it at like a tenth of the price. And I'm not exaggerating. The Pequonnet Concorde, with an in-house caliber, its own movement, French design, French source, hand assembled in Morteau, they start around like 4,000 euros, like single digits. Like, and again, they have a 36 millimeter titanium Concorde. They run, I think, in like the 4,800 range. Their Royale, their flagship kind of dressier model, they're about 8,500. Now compare that to Greubel Forsey starting around 400,000. Compare that to the Grönefelds starting in like the 30,000, even with the entry level Principia. This is it's interesting. It's a watch that you could actually buy, and they're a little bit harder to find in the US, but they are available. You can find them online as well. And the reason almost nobody is talking about Pequenet right now, the reason the brand is quiet, one of the kind of the open, I think it's one of the open secrets in hot horology adjacent watchmaking is that they don't have a marketing budget. They aren't doing, again, celebrity endorsements. They aren't on the watch internet's front page. They're a small French manufacturer in a small French town, quietly making watches with movements that have, engineering DNA from the top Swiss watchmakers, and they're priced in like the low four figures. And it's again, it's one of those gems I think that people just don't talk about. Oh, and by the way, they just, threw out a chronograph, right? And again, so again, this is, I think, one of the most exciting opportunities in this hobby right now. And if I'm reading this trajectory correctly, if any of you out there are paying attention to where the watch internet attention goes, remember the kids with the soccer balls and all that kind of stuff. I don't think Pequenet is going to stay quiet in this for much longer. Now, Pequenet's path is kind of the national path. Take the path from the Locle and Greubel Forsey, apply it to a country that hasn't had its own hot horology tradition in decades. Source everything locally, hire quietly from the top. Charge what it actually costs to make, not what your brand recognition would let you charge, right? And put these extraordinary watches on the wrists of people who would not otherwise be able to get anything in that price range with this much soul. The Concorde, again, is, in my opinion, one of the most underrated watches being made right now. Okay, so segment five, let's kind of bring this whole thing together. The thesis is kind of one workshop, three paths. So Greubel Forsey, we see them as this, well, at the beginning, we have three brands, we have three philosophies, and then there's one RMP. So Greubel Forsey took the maximalist path. They took the skills that they learned at RMP, they applied it to the question, what's the upper limit of horological invention, right? They pushed as hard as humanly possible and then they charge accordingly. They built a brand around the idea that the ceiling can always be raised, just one more meter. And the handmade one, you know, 6,000 hours per watch, north of a million each. That's an expression of that bloodline. And there's the Grönefelds, right? They chose to come home. They took these skills and the path of R&P and they brought that information back home. They brought it back to the small town that they grew up in. They brought it back to their family's workshop. And they make watches that are inspired by clock towers that their grandfather maintained. They stayed small. They let watches speak quietly. And, the 1941, the Remontoir, it was named after their father's birth year. They have a mechanism that's inspired by the Dutch Basilica clock, and it's in those watches are in their bloodline. And then we have Pequignet. They chose the national path. They took the skill, possibly direct from ex Greubel Forsey engineers, right? Put an asterisk on there. And they use it to revive an entire country's lost watchmaking tradition. They source everything locally. They built this manufacturer in France in a very significant location. They make in-house movements, they price them at a price that really shouldn't be possible, and they put extraordinary watches on the wrists of people who and otherwise wouldn't be able to afford them. And that too, I think, is the bloodline. So three completely different brands, three completely different price points, three completely different aesthetic and design languages, but they all trace back to the same place. I think all the way back. They all end up in the same workshop in the Locle. They are sitting next to each other, eating lunch, borrowing each other's tools. I think if they borrow each other's tools, I think some watchmakers are really funny. And so the skill is the same. What's different, I think, is the philosophy each watchmaker chose when they walked out the door, right? The intentions. So that is genuine and it's underappreciated. And it's this structural truth, I think, of independent watchmaking. And it's has these implications for the rest of the episode. And I think for everything that we're going to do moving forward in this show. So when you wear a watch from any of these brands or a watch from any other brand in the RMP lineage, including some that we definitely didn't talk about today, you're wearing a piece of that extended bloodline. You're wearing stuff that went through Locle. You went through sections of these other countries. And so I think, if you're looking at Morteau, you're looking at Geneva, you're starting to realize that this is not recognition. This is not the Rolex value. The bloodline doesn't show up in airport security, for example. It doesn't get noticed by your father in law. It does not in any visible way exist to anyone except the people who know. But it's real and it's documented. And again, it's the spine of the serious end of this hobby. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every independent brand you've investigated from here on out, you'll trace back to some watchmaker's bench. You will find the same names, the same training schools, the same workshop, and the hobby starts to feel like a very small and very intimate and very connected community. And that's exactly what it is. And that this gift of paying attention is something that you will hopefully be rewarded with because it's something that I've been rewarded with. And that's why I want to share it. The homework that I've done, I want to share with this community. So by going deep enough to see through some of these structures and looking underneath these brands, you can see a lot of the connections that I think sometimes we miss when we just look at a watch release. So segment 6, I'm going to call this the what to buy section because I think that sometimes that's fun or, what to admire section. So quickly, what to actually do with any of this information. If you have Greubel Forsey money, you know who you are and you're probably, already have a relationship with this, watchmaker in place. A note for the moment, and again, we talked about Stefan Forsey out of the brand that Greubel Robert is kind of majority in control of. So the next chapter is uncertain. I would say, you know, buy on the watch in front of you, not on the partnership that made it. In 2004 to 2025, Greubel Forsey's catalog again is going to age, I think, beautifully no matter what comes next. So don't panic about that. The Grönefelds, they are accessible hot horology options. And I say accessible again, air quotes, because we know how insane this hobby is. 1941 Principia starts around 30,000 euros, and it's kind of the brand's entry point. The 1941 Remontoir is kind of the soul piece, and it's what most collectors would kind of point you to. The 1941, the chronograph is the most recent GPHG winner, and in my view, one of the most beautiful chronographs made, kind of being made right now. But there's wait times and there's direct ordering potentially, and there's small production, and the brand is responsive. And Bart and Tim do answer like literally their own emails. And so next, we're going to get into Pequignet. And again, the watch I think most listeners would actually be able to buy this weekend. The Concorde starts around 4,000 euros. Again, the 40 millimeter steel variant. The 36 millimeter titanium is a little bit steeper in price. They have their dressier flagships that move up a little bit in prices as well, and they can be sold directly through Pequignet's website. You can go to Chrono24 and find some reputable dealers. You'll know them because they'll be in that same area, and sometimes they may be able to cut you a little bit of a deal, and then just be aware of tariffs and duties and all that kind of stuff. And they again, you can find a small handful of retailers, but there's no wait list, there's no drama, there's no AD relationship required. None of that nonsense. Just buy the watch. And if you take one recommendation from this episode, if you go home tonight, sit at your kitchen table and think, about the watch that's worth your attention, I think the Pequignet Concorde is the one I would point you to. 40 mil, 36 mil, that's your call. The 36 millimeter titanium is the move, I think, if you have a smaller wrist and it's slightly under the radar. The 40 millimeter steel is more classic in proportions, and then they sit very, very flat. So if you have a smaller wrist, the 40 millimeter is probably going to fit too big for you. So I'd lean you towards the 36. Now, if you want to wear the bloodline of RMP on your wrist without selling a kidney, again, the Pequonnet brand is probably going to be the most accessible answer for you. And I don't think that they're going to be accessible for long, but time will tell. I've been wrong before, but I hope that they're accessible for a little longer as people listen to this before people figure it out. Now, segment 7, let's talk about what's going to happen next. All right, so we are going to talk a little bit more about a specific brand. Now, there's one more name I want to introduce you to, and he isn't from RMP. His bloodline, I believe, is parallel and arguably, possibly even more elite. He came up through Patek Philippe, then through the complications house called BNB Concept, and then through FP Journe. He represents the other great training pipeline of modern independent watchmaking, and he deserves an entire episode, I believe, on his own. He's the youngest watchmaker I've named today, Albanian by birth, a Kosovo refugee as a teenager, and he arrived in Geneva at 12 years old and he was fleeing war. At 14, he beat out 300 other applicants for a watchmaking apprenticeship at Patek Philippe. And by his early 20s, he was leading a team of 15 watchmakers on tourbillons at BNB Concept. And then by his 20s, he was working at FP Journe, directly under Francois Paul. Now remember, when you hear Francois Paul, that's FP for FP Journe. And then at 25, he launched his own workshop in Geneva's Old Town. And his name? Rezepi. And you're going to hear it pronounced a bunch of different ways. You're going to hear Rexepi. My understanding is that it's pronounced Rezepi. And it's spelled Rexhep, and then his last name, Rex. And the workshop that you're going to learn about is called Akrivia, Akrivia. In the years since Rexep has launched, he's produced what many collectors and watch journalists believe are the finest hand-finished watches being done by any watchmaker alive. He has pieces that are small, beautifully proportioned dress watches. They sell at auction prices that if you don't know these watches, you would assume they must belong to something that you didn't understand. It's really difficult to understand. You wouldn't recognize the watch from around the room. They're quiet, they're refined, they're deeply traditional watches that almost no one on the street would notice. And they are the most extreme expression of this bloodline that we've traced. So the next episode, we're going to dedicate an entire deep dive episode to Bizet, his backstory. And let me tell you, it's extraordinary. The aesthetic of Akribia, the collaboration with Philippe Dufour, the auction pieces, the wait lists, the fundamental questions his works ask. which I think is the most important question in modern watchmaking. And the question is, what is the value of a watch nobody recognizes? That episode is coming up next. For now, go check out the Pequignet Concord. Trust me on that one. All right, so that is episode 12 of What's on Your Wrist Day. If this episode mapped something for you, if you can see the connective tissue running through these brands that you maybe didn't think or were related or unrelated, send me a message. I want to hear what you clicked on or what you kind of where you went down the rabbit hole. If Renaud and Papi, RMP, if there's an alumnus that we didn't get to today and you'd like for me to cover in a future episode, because there's a lot of them, tell me which ones you want me to cover. To Bart and Tim, and to the Pequignet team in Marteau, and to Stefan Forsey, I'm just excited to see what work is next. The hobby is bigger and richer because of all of you. I'm Wachowski. Take care of yourselves and wear something good.
Hey, Wachowski. Yeah. What's on your wrist, eh? Perpetual calendar, three-hander, stainless steel on my skin. I want a daily driver, not a shrine I can't fit in. Casio on Monday morning, Zella's got me saying stop. Topper Friday in the group chat, and my budget just got dropped. I can't afford that, still I stare at it. 80 can suck it, I'm in love with a habit. Lauren's group chat gonna make me broke. One more strap swap and I swear it's all a joke. What's on your wrist, eh? What's on your wristy? Daily driver, baby. What's on your wrist, eh? What's on your wrist, eh? I just can't resist. Watch that, watch that. Popped out crown on the wrist. Third swap of the day, yeah, I know. Brown on leather, steel on steel, then I change it for the show. Got it on my wish list, but I'm not acting rich. Reddit bros gonna fry us if I call this one a grail and switch. I can't afford that, still I stare at it. 80 can suck it, I didn't mean that. I'm in love with a habit. Shout back in the comments, got me losing sleep, but I laugh it off cause we don't take it too deep. What's on your wrist, eh? What's on your wristy? Daily driver, baby. What's on your wrist, eh? What's on your wrist, eh? I just can't resist. What's up? On the crap wrist. Perpetual calendar, three-hander and a dream. Stainless steel, a scratch or two. Still the king of the scene. Zella's new drop, stop. I click and then I flinch. Then I post, just browsing, and I buy it in a pinch. What's on your wrist, eh? What's on your wrist, eh? Daily driver, baby. What's on your wrist, eh? What's on your wrist, eh? I just can't resist. Watch out. On the crap parade. What's on your wrist? What's on your wrist? What's on your wrist? What's on your wrist? Lauren's group chat gonna make me broke again. What's on your wrist, eh? Hey, what's on your wrist, eh? What's up, ski? Let's go. We don't take ourselves too seriously.